All right, so the goal for the next hour is really to hear from you all of how you think this data could make a difference in your work, suggestions that you have for follow-up research, questions that you have, but most importantly, what does this mean for you and your organization? And we won't go around the room and introduce everyone, but we really do have some remarkable people and remarkable organizations in this room. We have Head Start, we have the Child Welfare League of America, we obviously have the panelists and the organizations that they represent, we have many religious organizations, faith-based organizations, and we have those who are, faith-based organizations have a concern with all four family cultures in some way. And then we have organizations that tend to serve one or the other of the family clusters. So just to kind of bring some order into this conversation, I want to reiterate some of the difficulties that we've noted and then kind of work through in the same format that we dropped this executive report of what's the state of the family and some of the problems that all American families face, some concerns that we have, and then the family cultures and what specific concerns or vulnerabilities we see and what strengths we see, if that makes sense. So the areas, starting with the big picture, what all American families seem to hold in common and how families respond, these are some of the concerns that we've flagged as a group. Neighborhoods. Parents don't know their neighbors. Their children don't play outside, and there's an inordinate fear of strangers, what Jeff has called the stranger danger. And, as so many people have said today, perception is more important than reality. And so, statistically, this is not a concern that needs to be in place. It's certainly not operative, but it is. So that's a concern that we have. The second concern is, in the first part of our report, are parent connections. Parent support as parents and parent support as adults. And again, this emerges in the list of questions that we'll eventually be able to disseminate to everyone. But how much time are you spending with friends? We have data on that as well. The answer is not much. And this cuts across all economic and racial and religious affiliation profiles, although people with strong religious affiliation tend to feel more connected. And then we have the problem of parental denial, about teens' use of alcohol and drugs and sexual promiscuity, about obesity, and we have the pressure of the therapeutic familism, that given all this, parents being by themselves, feeling isolated, feeling alone, the solution is to double down on the family. And you can see how that becomes a difficult situation. So the question for you all, from all of your different spheres, the families that you work with, is how do you respond to this? I'm just opening the floor, and what I will do is keep a list, and we will be able to publish this later, to circulate this among you all. Of course, what we all hope is that you'll stay engaged with this research and that you'll look at our more in-depth reports and that you'll engage with our researchers on an ongoing basis so that this data doesn't just stay in the University of Virginia website. That's what we're hoping. So who wants to start? We've got 2 mics floating around. Surely someone has some ideas about how to respond.
My name is Irene Clements, and I'm the president of the National Foster Parent Association. So the families that I represent are families who volunteer to take other people's children into their homes. And I was watching and listening. One of the things that struck me is they all fall into one of these 4 categories. And the kids that come into their home, their families fall in one of those 4 categories, and they probably are not the same. I mean, it would be lucky if they were, probably. So my thought is, how do we, because when children are being raised by parents of one category who respond to things one way, and then they get kids in who, this is going to be a foreign way of responding to parenting. which we wonder why kids are so confused sometimes
Mm-hmm.
and distraught, besides the trauma of moving in with somebody they don't know, of course. But part of this could be just that whole style that we're looking at of who these parents are and what their inner beliefs are and how they effectively parent with that. So I think it gives us and will give us a whole new way of looking at how to support these families better, what kinds of things we need to look at with the dynamics and the demographics of each of the children that come in their home, and then how do we marry those two together if it's very obvious that they're different.
That's really interesting.
I think that's the biggest thing. The other is I think it can help us when we're looking at recruiting families to foster and adopt. Knowing the children that come into the system and what they've been through, that there were probably some of these categories of people who could accept those children on the long haul more successfully than others.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the ways that culture operates is that whichever culture we're a part of, we can't really conceive it any other way. I mean, this is just our world. That's how culture works. And so I can imagine that I wouldn't have thought of this, but your children and your families are dealing with a culture clash. And so how do you operationalize that? How do you make that practical? Does anybody else in the room have a similar organization that might have to do this kind of cross-cultural negotiation? Or families?
Well, I'd just like to, I'm the executive director of Parent to Parent USA, and we actually we've created a database in 32 states right now, and we're trying to reach 50. And actually tomorrow I have a meeting with Washington, D.C. who wants to start one. But we actually do very close database matching between families. So when a family finds out that their child, this is just one example, but it would work in almost any arena. But if you find out your child has a disability, you just get the news, and all of a sudden your next door neighbor is clueless of how to help you, even if you were good friends. Your own family most times has no clue how to help you. And oftentimes siblings, I mean, it just kind of like creates an upheaval. But when you can make matches with other families who have already offered to be a support parent to that family, and then they receive training in good communication skills, good relationship skills. They go through about a 6-hour training. Sometimes we even do it online. And then we've got these wonderful detailed databases where oftentimes when it comes down to the match, if we can get maybe 5, 6 different possible matches, we can hone in so closely to a match that will probably go on to be a friendship for life. Like one time a father wanted to be matched to another father whose children had Down syndrome. And, well, we had tons of matches in this particular state for that. So we were able to hone all the way down, and it turns out that there was another dad within driving distance, easy driving distance, we went all the way down to the hobby of gardening. And they have been lifelong friends now for, oh my goodness, at least 15 years. So you can do this, but it does take effort. But it is almost like an eHarmony type of thing, but it's for something that's more crucial in my opinion.
Thank you. Let me just interrupt just for a moment. I had told Irene to make an announcement, and I forgot to. Please, she had something that you all might be interested in.
Okay. Yes, I was at a very interesting meeting last week at the American Academy of Pediatrics National Office in Illinois, and it's a program called Bright Futures. And it's sponsored by the Academy as well as another group called Family Values. And they've developed a lot of material, a lot of information on how to help families be more successful in being healthy, both physical and mental health, and of course providing safety for their families, but also looking at the overall general well-being of everybody in the family. And so they were desperately looking for some people to add to their advisory group to help them figure out better ways to do this, better ways to disseminate information. Look at the information again, make sure it's accurate, if anything needs to be changed. So I've also already touched base with our fatherhood fellow over here and got his card. And but if anybody else is interested in something like that, they're going to be meeting once a year, and then physically, and then monthly to quarterly by conference call or something as things come up and they're developing new material. But I know one of the things they identified last week that they definitely needed was fatherhood leadership, and so this is a perfect place to make that kind of connection. But certainly also with others that might feel that this would be an avenue, again, to participate in working with families in a different way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Irene. So see Irene after the meeting if you're interested. So back to Irene and Kathy's comment about actually, situations where you have to match families. I'm wondering, I think Kathy mentioned all the kinds of questions that they use and the good matches that they have. I'm wondering for someone like Irene, where you're actually taking a family into, you're actually living quarters. I'm just wondering if some of the questions on our questionnaire might be helpful as you develop a rubric for that. Does any one of our researchers want to say anything about that? Or no? Okay. All right. Anyone else on that line of inquiry? Go ahead.
Some of the things that we found very successful in the parenting work, and I'm thinking about the foster care system, is that lucky for us, there's a lot of data for what's working and for families who have already done this well. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes that kind of resource we don't always tap into as much as we should. And, thinking about the foster care system, it's been around for a very long time and it's successful in its magnitude. So how do we now go back and learn from families kind of who've already done it, success stories, and just understanding that, people are actually doing this quite well. So how do we reach them and then learn from them to then move forward?
Okay. Anyone else on that? That kind of thinking? All right, what about the issue of neighborhoods? What about just the physical infrastructure that parents live with? And the interesting thing is that came out with Jeff's in particular is that parents know it's a problem that they don't know their neighbors. They know it's a problem that they can't let their children go around the block on their bike without worrying. So they don't like that fact, but they feel that they just can't bring themselves to let go a little bit. So what can organizations do to mediate that? Help people, I don't know, what's needed? First, what's needed, and then what can you do about it? Almeida's got one. Almeida, say your name and your affiliation too.
Almeida Richards Keys, and DC Head Start Association President and Executive Director of the Edward Mazik Parent-Child Center here in Washington, DC. And when you start to talk about neighborhoods, many of the families that I work with don't have neighborhoods. They're homeless families, and Head Start, the thrust of the Head Start program is parent engagement, getting parents involved in the program, getting parents involved in the education of their children. I can speak firsthand as a former Head Start parent that Head Start works in terms of engaging families and getting them to look at their critical needs. Now, what your work will do, I think, for the Head Start community, and I think that I'm speaking across the board, is to get programs to look at other issues that are important to families. We've focused on the health needs of the children and the families, on the social services of the children and the families. We have not looked as closely at what technology fears families have today, and also how they are so concerned about, because to us, all families are concerned about the safety of their children. And many of the families, until I guess it was brought out through the media, through the years, about how unsafe neighborhoods were, many families didn't really concentrate on how poor they were, but they concentrated on how they can bring their children to a point where there's level playing ground, where they can compete, where they can get some of the same opportunities that other families are having. So your work will definitely make us go back and look at other critical needs. I was very interested in hearing that through the interviews, how when some parents were interviewed, the children spoke up and they sort of answered some of the questions, which brings us back to Dr. Gerald Newmark wrote a book about how to raise emotionally healthy children, how children want to feel accepted, how they want to feel respected, important, included, how they want to feel secure. And just the fact that you were interviewing parents and children wanted to voice their opinions let us know that we have to go back to listening to what our children say. So I think that what you've done, and I applaud the work that you're doing. I really think, like Ms. Dehaney has said, that there is a lot of data out there that we can also take into consideration what data has been presented and how we are informing our work by the data that's already been presented. But your work is critical to the messaging that's out there that our families are listening to, and maybe we just had not gone into an area where we need to go into.
Okay, thank you. Willie?
Yeah, I want to take us in a different direction. As we talk about neighborhoods, my observation is neighborhoods no longer exist. Rural, urban no longer exist based on technology. But there is a website, and I might have it wrong, www.youthgov.org. You Google in the zip code, they'll tell you about capacity building for that community. Whether or not it's a school, a church, Boys and Girls Club, scouting. So that capacity is already there on the innovation related from the White House. And so other organizations have built that as well. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, we just need to find the assets. But the terms that we use based on our generation is not the terms our young people are using. That's why they Google in and get what they want in a matter of seconds. So same with office space. World War II mentality on buildings, your computer is your office. So I just wanted to open us up a little bit to see that there are some very positive things from the technology piece that we need to learn about as well, based on assets available to us.
I agree with that. I just want to say, I just have one question. What do you mean when you said that neighborhoods didn't exist? And
Talking about physical piece,
yes,
boundaries.
yes.
I'm saying that in the minds of
So you're saying in the minds of a lot of these younger people in particular, they don't miss the neighborhood. Is that what you're saying? Because they feel connected by the internet.
Yes, I'm saying the terminology we're using.
Right.
The world is flat. They can go anywhere in the world.
Right.
I learned that when I was in a little town called Louisiana, out with some farmers on a $250,000 tractor. He said, I can trade and do whatever I want from this tractor in rural America, so it's no longer rural America anymore. I've even had law enforcement people to say that to me too. The
But-
terminology that we use versus where we are.
I think we could still talk about whether, though, the connectedness on the internet is I mean, certainly it's not a substitute for being able to walk next door and have a conversation with your neighbor, or saying, I've got to run out to the doctor, can you watch my baby? You know, that kind of, not really sure that could ever really be replaced with anything.
Well, I can Google your house with your name and tell you whatever I want to know about you. So I
That's
think it's
true.
already been replaced.
But wait, is someone going to take issue with it? Go ahead. Go ahead, Almeida, and then we'll go to Ray Pennings.
I think that technology is important to families, but I don't think that technology could ever replace that personal relationship between a family and the neighbor that's right next door. I think that we should be teaching our families to, especially those who are not in that area, to reach out and teaching them how to reach out to the neighbor next door. So I think that what you've done is given us an opportunity to start our families talking about their communities outside of technology and helping technology to inform what they're doing.
Because note that it's having a daily effect on families, because parents are really afraid of their neighbors. I mean, that, you saw it in Jeff's interviews. I don't know what so-and-so is doing across the street. I don't know if he's an alcoholic. Well, he may not be an alcoholic. Maybe okay to let your kid play with his kid. That fear has a material impact on so they're connecting, but they're not connecting in that way. And that's having the consequence on children being outside, for example. Ray?
I wonder if at this point, though, the language becomes very important, because by neighborhood, people think of geography. And I think what is happening is that where we used to connect most intimately with those who were geographically proximate to us, today, that is no longer the network that we connect with. I live in Calgary. My colleagues are all over North America. Facebook is our water cooler. You would joke back, and that's true. My son is 3,000 kilometers, however many miles that is, but from all his family members, and yet his network is across North America. It isn't. So, I think that doesn't get away from the fact that in terms of some of our physical needs, geographic proximity remains important. There's some things you can't farm out, but in terms of many of the relationships, they are no longer bounded by geography and geographic proximity, and I think that has introduced a whole different sense of who is our neighbor, and that sense of connectedness. And I think sometimes we get caught by the geographic terminology that we're using.
I think that's true. I wonder if one of our researchers might want to say something about thick versus thin relationships. I mean, we have, the part of the physical aspect of it is someone knows you, they know your behavior. They don't just know your words. And so some data suggests that people use social media to connect, to get together, but I don't think you can equate professional relationships around the world with someone who knows you in all different kinds of roles. It's just it's different. It's not good or bad, it's just different, and we have to be I think what we see in this report is there is a concern that deeper knowing on a more daily basis, on a more material basis, is not so present. Does any one of our researchers want to say something about that briefly? Jeff, maybe?
You get a chance for your question, Gary.
Gary's next.
So Ray, I think you're right about that. The change in the kinds of boundaries. But I think, in as much as the neighborhood provides a kind of physical space for children, these parents still seem to feel like there's a loss in their experience from when they were children, and those are just changes, right? But to be connected through technology is a strength of technology, but they also feel like those boundaries that are now created in the physical space around the home somehow change the nature of the childhood experience. And I think how that changes it and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is yet to be determined. But I think the important thing here is that the perception among parents is that change definitely affects and has consequences for even the moral development of the child.
And it's not just for the children's experience, it's for the parents' experience too, because that one of the questions that Carl's survey asks is where are your sources of support? Very few people called upon their neighbors for support. Go ahead, Gary.
I would like to bring to our attention an element of neighborhoods that sometimes are overlooked, and they have impact on families. Let me just give quickly a couple of statistics. There are almost 1 million people in prison in our country. We have more people in prison than any other nation on earth, okay? But it's not the 1 million people there. That impacts on families, another perhaps 3 million people out there that are also in prison by their spouse or father or whatever in prison. We have 2.5 million, almost 3 in the armed forces that have separations, continual, that impact on the family. And in my work, I'm doing training with chaplains in the prisons and in the military and in the hospitals. the trauma that occurs, whether it's an illness or whether it's a disaster such as occurred in New York, impacts families, not just for the short time that that trauma exists, but for long periods. It's disruptive. And there's an incongruity, even in this conservative-based organization, values-based of the military, with the values and the current family structures that are in place. We have 3 million refugee immigrants in this country. 3 million that have been granted legal refugee status. That's another group that is a family out there that is in constant state of change. And how do we deal with these subcultures, in essence, and the impact? I'm grateful for this breakout of families, because it gives me a structure to help train chaplains to identify and to reach out to people in their ministry to other people. But so thank you.
Thank you.
Go
ahead.
Thanks. So when it comes to the research, again, I would reiterate, yeah, thank you. This is very helpful. I work with Family Life, and we're trying to develop practical resources. How can I give a parent a tool to help them connect with their kids or with each other? So when I think about the research, I think the thing that would be helpful maybe at a next stage is, so why do they feel like they can't trust their neighbor? Or what are the root issues underneath that? Is it the media, the fears that come about from that? Is it that legitimate concerns as well? Are there some legitimate concerns? But that would help us to dig into, okay, so here's a practical tool that'll really hit that. And are there connections between, okay, so people are saying they're isolated, but yet they have thousands of friends on, friends on whatever site.
Right.
I can tweet that I'm, alone, but yet I need someone to physically bring me a meal or come and visit with me to really start to feel connected. So to get at some of those root issues and the connections with other concerns would be, this is very helpful, and it'd be another layer of helpfulness within the research.
Well, I wonder if one of our researchers wants to say anything about the reasons behind. We don't know, but we speculated a little bit. But after we finish that conversation, I really want to spend some time on the denial part. So if we could just go on to denial, we can. I know everyone has a lot of points. What? Oh, okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay. Well, as we were talking, there's a question that I've had lingering for a long time, that I don't think people who think about families, deal with families, have really reckoned with, that, in years gone by, when we were primarily an agricultural society, families worked together as an economic producing unit, and children were an economic asset, and that changed fundamentally once we had, the Industrial Revolution, let alone now the information age. But, when husbands or wives leave the house to go to work, and children, go off to school, and then that fundamentally changes families. And, when we talk about, traditional families, traditional family values, we're normally thinking 1950s, but yet I don't know that we ever reckoned with this notion of the change from the economic producing organization versus the consuming organization. So anyway, and I've never heard anyone who was an academic wrestle with that. So that's just something that I would like to see happen at some point.
James, do you want to say something? Okay.
There's a lot of research.
There is quite a lot of research about that.
Historians of the family and historical sociologists have addressed this in great length. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of how that changes the nature of relationships now, I mean, I know it's been looked at in terms of observations that, it was like this and now it's like this, but in terms of the implications for relationships and
Well, certainly one of the things it's done is that's one more factor in the diminishment of parental authority, because kids are at school all the time or they're having summer jobs. So that certainly is it certainly is a factor in how all of our relationships work. Do you want to say something really quickly, and then I want to talk about parental denial?
Well, this might be a denial question, but has any research been done on the type of parenting that people had and how it affected them? In other words, my mom said, she said, well, how do you get such great kids? She said, benign neglect. And I'm thinking, did I have a detached parents? In other words, we just were kind of raised by wolves, you know, and there wasn't this intentional character building. You know, we went to church every week, but I mean, is it all the subconscious stuff rather than the intentional stuff that makes a difference?
I think that some of that has to do with this therapeutic familism, this perception that now it's all on me as a parent. And Jeff, you want to say something about people's perceptions of their parents raising them, and whether that's realistic, or to Eric's question?
Yeah, well, we certainly asked, I think it's a mixed bag, and I think the survey actually gets at some of this too. Some parents, current parents that we're talking to, want to, you know, reject how they were raised and are trying to do things very differently. But it's not the majority of parents, right, Carl, in the survey? So there is a kind of continuity. Now the context is very different, right? And they know that, so they know that things need to change. But it's not the majority that would say the way I was raised is old-fashioned. I need to do something different. They're still trying to adapt, but that would be more the minority, I think, in terms of the, you know, tossing out.
Okay. Let's talk about this factor of all the disconnect between how parents perceive their children and what our national data tells us. I mean, that was something that struck me the first time I went through this data. Carl, did you want to say something on this? I'm sorry.
Yes, I was just thinking that, you know, I think we need to remember from the survey how, excuse me, I don't have much voice, but how close parents believe they are to their kids, and how, in reflecting upon their own families growing up and their families today, most of them evaluate their family life more highly than what they experienced as children growing up. And that's something to keep in mind as we're talking. Also, it was striking to me, and I wouldn't have predicted it, how much they say their children share not only their religious faith and values, but their understandings of morality and all of that. And that was an overwhelming response in the survey. So that doesn't correspond too directly with some of the comments that are talking about a gap or you know, kids being drawn away. I'd say that's certainly not the sense that most parents had in the survey.
Okay, thank you, Carl. So, I mean, all of us are in denial about some things, right? This is part of the human condition. But it was striking that parents perceive their children differently, perceive their own skills as parents differently. And I think there's probably not a practitioner in this room who doesn't have to deal with this in some fashion. If you're in the classroom, you have to deal with parents who don't believe their child does anything wrong. If you're Jill Woods, who works with addictions and so forth, parents are in denial about the necessity of talking about this. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the level of denial that we see here in these surveys, and what response could be made.
Just a question for clarification on this. The parents today are the children of baby boomers. Do we have any historical, like previous data from different eras to, like, is this, my own sense is the baby boomer is a very unique phenomena in terms of a number of the values and how that all translates. And is that a factor that if we did this 10 years from now, it will look different, not just because of 10 years of change, but because of that particular...
That's a really interesting question. Does anybody want to take a crack at that one? Dr. Hartman?
Hi, Heidi Hartman from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Sorry, I arrived late. I want to go back to the other question about why parents think things are better than they are. I honestly think that's just a part of human nature. I mean, if you are a parent, You are responsible for your child, and you have to raise that child. So you want to believe you're doing a good job, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do the same job tomorrow. I once said to my mother, who, my parents were divorced when I was 4, and in that era that was very unusual, and my mother was a German immigrant. She'd been to high school, but she couldn't earn much more than the minimum wage, and she had to support 2 children on it. So I went off to a fancy college on scholarship, and I came home, and I said something like, well, Mom, you're just exploited. And she was crushed. And there was a friend with me, and he said, you can't say that to your mother. And people deny their reality all the time because they want to do. My mother was very proud of the fact that she did an excellent job at work. She had very good relationships with her coworkers, her boss, her customers. She worked in retail. People all over this small town we lived in knew my mother. And, she didn't want to believe that she was economically exploited, even if she was. And so I think that, people just have to keep going. And this is their survival mechanism. This is the way they survive. In terms of the baby boom, I wish I did know more about the different parenting cultures of the baby boom, but it perhaps does, I'm sure it does have some effect, and I'm sure we could, through further research, figure that out.
Yeah, so my background is in history, and my temptation is always, my default mode is always to say, well, we've been through this before, and this is, this is part of the human condition, or this is how we always cope. And I think when it comes to denial, I think that's certainly true. We have a psychologist on our advisory board who said, this is just how humans cope with adversity. We have to. This is how we have to. And yet I think, those of us who have been in the classroom with parents know that there's something is a little bit different, I think, with the level of denial. I don't know if anyone in this room has had to deal with, go to a parent and say, your child did X wrong. And maybe, my experience is 35 years ago, the parents would have been the one punishing the child. And now the parent vigorously denies it. So I think there's maybe, just one of the researchers want to say something about this? The historicity of the ubiquity of denial, the unavoidability of denial, and yet is there something that's really different? James?
Well, I think the point has actually already been made, that to the extent that there is something different in the direction that you're describing, Ashley, it's a function of the ways in which parents identify with their children. They see their children as a projection of their own aspirations, their own success and failure in the world. And it's hard to cope with the idea that you're failing at something. And there's in a context of what some have called a hyper-sentimentalized family, it just cuts very deeply to imagine yourself failing, your children failing, when the very language of a good life has been reduced to success or failure. This is new.
Mm-hmm.
The language of a good life used to be a story about the ups and the downs. It was a story about how you dealt with adversity. It wasn't about achievement. Now, again, in this new context, we see the good life through a different moral vocabulary, one, again, that I think heightens the importance of success versus failure. We see ourselves and our children through that prism, and if we can't tell that story, it's pretty hard to deal with.
That's a really good point, and it's raising the question in my mind about organizations that work with families being able to norm the failures, as it were, being able to help. I'm wondering if this is a practical thing that organizations can do. If it's a religious organization, clearly it's easy to say humans are fallen, humans are broken, and we're made in the image of God, but we're broken, and it's okay to fail. And we all fail, to kind of norm the failure. And then there are other ways of norming failure. Anyone have any thoughts about that? Just to increase the comfort level. Well, this is reality we live in. We're imperfect. I think John was first.
I do wonder if there isn't a connection between the lack of teachability to trust. I'm more likely to listen to people I know and trust, but if I don't know anyone, who can I trust? Even what news channel can I trust? There seems to be a complete lack of disengagement on so many levels of trustworthy sources. So that's going to lead me to a bit of delusionment and denial often.
Let's let Elena talk because she's had something on her mind for a while.
Well, I was just responding to this piece of it is just, it makes me think about the idea of there being a lack of authority in the family now, and perhaps if you find that your child is having a problem, the teacher tells them something, part of reaction, if you have no recourse because you have no discipline system within your own family, then perhaps denial is a better way of dealing with that, or your first way of dealing with it, or only way of dealing with it.
So these are all, it's interesting that you say that because that all circles back as part of the same phenomenon. So then you have, it's interesting, so then you have the parents who don't have that sense of their own authority, and so the denial is a function of, I can't do anything about this. It's very, very interesting. Somebody else, Cheryl? Oh wait, who was first? Go ahead.
Okay. Lisa Parker with
Hey,
Attachment Parenting International. Just a couple of thoughts, one on the denial part. I'm wondering if it could reflect deeper wounds that the parents haven't come, to deal with or recognized. I know that there are books written. I know Harville Hendricks has written in his book, Giving the Love That Heals, a guide for parents about, that when children are a certain age and you're having difficulty dealing with that, it could oftentimes is reflective of the wounds that you experienced at that age as a child. And then as a teacher, I saw that with the parents that I worked with because they had so many wounds from their own experiences in school that it just reopened that wound if their child was experiencing those things. So that's just a couple of points on that.
Let's take one more comment on the denial, and then let's talk about familism. Who hasn't had a chance to say anything yet? Yay, Jill.
Jill Woods again with Not My Kid. Hence the name Not My Kid. It was actually founded by a family in Phoenix whose son, they struggled with their son in substance abuse, but had no idea until he was in college. And they had to pull him out of his freshman year at Boulder. When they got him home, realized he was a full-blown cocaine addict. In family counseling, they found out that he'd been using drugs since 9th grade. Started on a student government trip, smoking pot with a senior cheerleader who offered it to him. And therein was the denial. It was because the boy was a straight-A student. He was president of student council all 4 years, ran track, played basketball. On paper, a perfect child. So we deal with a lot of families like this in denial because they just don't see it can't be my kid. It can be somebody else's kid, but it's not going to be my kid. And the education that we try to provide for the parents still doesn't register for so many because they believe it just can't be my. Why would my kid be depressed? Why would they be cutting? They live in a beautiful home. They've got everything they need. They're educated. They just can't fathom that it could actually happen to their child. Some of our largest donors are ones that it was their child, they found out. It's a blame issue. So many people they feel guilty, parents, they're blamed. I say with our organization, they either think it's bad parenting or bad child.
Right.
And until it happens to them, they just don't get it.
Let's let Laura, I think Laura's got her hand up, and then we'll move on to a different angle on all of this.
One quick comment that ties in with what Jill was saying. We haven't yet talked, and perhaps we will, about the quick go-to for medicine and pharmacological interventions to treat symptoms. And I hope that people are alarmed that the language in the report is not very strong in terms of the percentage of kids who are taking medicine for attentional focus, academic kinds of issues, as well as anxiety and mood issues. But that's a dramatic increase in terms of pharmacological applications for children's behavior, which really, we're talking about symptom reduction, not cause addressing, but symptom reduction. And when the vast body of research, particularly the longitudinal research on how to work best with these kind of interventions, medicine, anything that essentially alters, is, quote, invasive in the sense of altering one's body chemistry, that's the last line of defense after you've exhausted all cognitive and behavioral, academic, and other social types of interventions. But yet, culturally, the culture of the quick fix goes immediately to this with the focus on symptom reduction, again, I think as a buffer against having to own whatever contribution, whether it's a biological contribution or a sociocultural contribution, but we bypass that by focusing on the symptoms. And I think it's part of what's entrenched in our culture to focus on symptoms rather than sources.
And so a corollary of that is just the reductionistic view of the human person, that when there's something wrong, you solve it quickly, you solve it biologically, instead of looking at the whole organic system. So a lot of this, I want to spend just a minute talking about the problem of the therapeutic familism. And I wondered how many of you who work in organizations that are trying to build up the family and champion the family as a really important unit, which we all agree that it is, how do you square that with the concern that the family becomes elevated and pressured to the extent that we saw in this study? How does that play out for your organizations or your families? What concerns do you have? What can be done about that?
Lori Presbys from the Christian Family Movement. That's one of the things that keeps people from getting together with other parents and forming relationships is that they feel that their first duty is to take their child to their child's activity. And that they must be there to watch the child perform the activity. And that becomes the all-encompassing activity of the family's life, never making connections among adults, but always keep putting the child first. And I see that as part of that therapeutic familism.
So how do you deal with that as an organization? What message do you give your parents of, yes, we want you to be wonderful, present, active, interested parents, but we don't, there's a problem if that's all you are, and if that's your emphasis. Go ahead.
I just had a question in terms of the research. If you saw a correlation between, I don't know, I guess you'd call it the faithful group, and the anxiety, because the traditional role of faith has been to play a role in counterbalancing anxiety. I mean, there's supposed to be a connection there, and I didn't know if you saw that in the research or not.
That's a really good question. Carl or Megan? Anyone?
I think the most prudent thing to do would be to say we haven't looked into that yet. I have my hunches, but I don't really know the data very thoroughly on that. My sense would be, though, that engaged progressives in some ways are more positive in their attitudes than the members of the faithful family culture.
Because the faithful see the world out there as frightening.
As alien. Yeah.
And have lower social trust, actually. I'm wondering about, go ahead, Eric.
James Hunter said something. James, you still in here? Yeah, it just says it very profound, and it's kind of the story we find ourselves in. And a couple months ago I read Mysterious Island. Jules Verne's, I don't know why I read it, a guy from work recommended it, but the key line is these prisoners during the Civil War getting a weather balloon, or getting a balloon, and they're 7,000 miles into the South Pacific. Sounds a little bit like Gilligan's Island, but the key line in the whole book to me was the one guy that said, "We are not castaways, we're colonizers." And it's kind of like how you frame that picture. If you're a castaway, you write help on the beach, you put a lean-to, hope you can make fire and wait to be rescued. That's one storyline. The other one is, though, we are colonizers, and they, you know, it was a book about the times because they use all the natural elements, made all these incredible inventions. But then we're going to claim this for the U.S. And if it's kind of like we have a story that we just have to hang in against bad culture, you know, and just put up our walls of defense and protect ourselves, rather than raising kids to be transformational agents to redeem everything that's broken in the world. That's two different stories people find
Right.
themselves in.
Right, that's a very
And
good point.
I think to pick up the conversation at a higher level, all of us here as agents of, we think we're change agents, that story's big. That helps frame all the other little things. So to your point, the story's changed on us. It's not how you deal. Success is how you deal with adversity. No, success now is never failing. So I make up a story to make it look like I've never failed, rather than, you know, my kids went through some very hard times. I had a son that was on drugs, but he went through rehab, and he still goes to AA meetings, but I'm so proud of him, he's made it. That needs to be a more common story than,
I think that's a very-
we did all the right things, and he just obeyed us always, and such a good kid, went up to college straight A's, and he was Phi Beta Kappa.
Eric. So the power of story and the kind of narrative that we give our parents is really, it's important. And that's that, and I think particularly for the faithful, that may be one of the keys, is how you see yourself in the world. And are you the social trust factor? Let's let Willie say something about this, and then let's take it in a different direction.
Yes, I want to use Boys and Girls Clubs as an example when we talk about competition versus sportsmanship. Many instances, our young people are struggling with the foundation component. So just to show you, I didn't dress rehearse this. I believe in God and the right to worship Him according to my own faith and religion. I believe in America, American way of life, Constitution, Bill of Rights. I believe in my Boys and Girls Club, which stands for all of these things. What did I just say as a parent, where a parent may be struggling in a community, can bring their child to a Boys and Girls Club to instill those same values and things that we talk about? We look today, we see competition. We don't teach sportsmanship. I was taught sportsmanship. That's why I remember that, because I could not come into that Boys and Girls Club when I was younger unless I knew the Boys and Girls Club code and what it really meant. That's what we got to get back to. So I just wanted to share that in a very special way, as in walking the talk. It really works.
So what I want to do in the last few minutes, first of all, I don't want to forget, which I know I'll forget if I don't say it now, to ask you all to fill out a little questionnaire about this conference. Don't do it right now. Don't do it right now. Just finish our conversation. But it's really important to us that we get your feedback, because not everyone's been able to say what's on their mind, ideas that you have for people we should send our report to, what you need, what you would like, how we can help you more concretely. It's in, and we put it in your executive report. So if you don't mind, give it to one of us, and we'll, you be anonymous or not, whatever you want to say. And then finally, what I wanted to do in the last 5 or 6 minutes is to talk about knowing the landscape of the family cultures and the effect that has on how you think about the families that you work with. I just want to read from the executive report. Family culture acts, this is on page 35 and 36. Family culture acts as a filter for the larger culture. Its role in forming character ideals among the young is fundamental and irreducible to other factors. Whether or not parents are deliberate about it, they create a moral ecology through which children come to understand and internalize the moral life of the larger world. It's therefore important that practitioners, schools, and other social support systems become aware of the nature and characteristics of family cultures. So, look, again, you all have organizations that work with different segments, or perhaps all, but I'm wondering if you had any thoughts of how to make this how to translate this research into the public square for the common good. And open floor. Anyone? I think Irene.
I think that this, and again, I see, I'm coming from this whole child protection background. But I see this work as incredibly informative to people who go out and investigate abuse and neglect allegations. Because this is something, there is no understanding of the types of families that they're dealing with. And I think if they could look at the families they're investigating through these lenses, it would give them a better perspective on how to assess future safety or immediate removal of those children. And then that would also give them some information to provide on to the next people about who those kids are and how they've been parented. But then when it goes to the treatment of those families, if you can, instill this information into those supports and services that are provided to those families, and get to them more directly, because you know exactly kind of where they're at and how to be more communicative with them, where they're going to understand what you're saying to them, and you can be more effective. I think this would have a huge impact on that whole system, but it would mean getting it out to every state and child protection entity in those states and all those private sector people who also do this work.
Well, maybe our research team, as we start coming public with those questions, those might be of use to you in that process. So thank you for that. Is there one over here?
And just building on that in the particular context, looking at the denial piece and understanding that parents are using that as a way to forge ahead in terms of the comments that were being made before, and that they don't necessarily conceive of social risks in the same way that we as practitioners and do, and that their lives seem more functional, and so somehow embracing that as a strength or an inroad into connecting with the parent. And I think certainly on the challenge of social supports, it's something that could strengthen families and both at risk of abuse and neglect, and certainly working with the system in terms of either reunification or moving towards an alternative form of permanency. And I think identifying a way to make those connections, and I think there are certainly several organizations here that do great work in that regard, but in opening those doors for the families.
Thank you. Okay. No, fine.
Claudio Consuegra, the Family Ministries Director for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. I would think there are several things or several ways that we can utilize media to reach the parents, because that's the media today. For instance, 2 to 3 minute YouTube videos that parents could actually watch, a scenario that they can sort of learn from. You play what a couple is having to deal with their child, and just by watching it, they can put it into practice in their own life. A simple e-newsletter. Printing stuff costs so much, but one simple e-newsletter that can be forwarded to millions of people in everyone's network can be so much more effective than printing a book that some people may not buy, may not be interested in. So utilizing the media to the most that you can, I think, would translate the research into practical ways to reaching the parents.
Okay. Elena?
I think in our organization, we can really use it as a training tool, because it does provide a different language for looking at families. And there's so much, when you're working with a national organization, there's so much diversity across the country in terms of who you're working with and what that means. So even just getting, in my case, Boys and Girls Club staff or other practitioners to question their own assumptions about families can be really valuable, and parents and what it is that they want for their kids, because we don't always make the positive assumptions about that, but it can really get a good conversation and dialogue going and be used in terms of training. And there are a lot of organizations out there that do some of that. The Search Institute does family strength-based training. That might be a good place to share this kind of information, see what they could do with it as well.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, I think.
Well, I was just going to say that what our organization has done for the last 18 years fairly successfully is provide parent support groups, and we realize that a lot of attention is on high risk, low socioeconomic strata, but we find that parents of all levels, at all levels, need help and support. And so I did an initial study in '04 finding that even though these parents self-selected to come to our support groups, we assumed that they would probably, and most people assumed that they'd be more nurturing, but in fact they fell right in the middle of the bell curve. So these were parents whose intentions were there, that they wanted to be better parents and they wanted to address, at least recognize the way they were raised wasn't ideal. They wanted to make changes. So I think that the research certainly, continues to support the work that we do in terms of providing support for all parents.
Well, and I hope, just to both of your points, that you know that the research that we have, again, we can't stress it too much. It's so much deeper than just what you see on the executive report. I mean, if you're, Elena, when you're working with rural families, we have data on the differences between, and there's substantial differences between families in the city and families in the country, and almost every way, how they feel about education, for example. Those kinds of things are really distinctive.
Well, it's just about 2 o'clock, and I think time to wrap things up. You have been so generous with your time in coming. We academics are comfortable with abstraction. And I, as much as anyone, love abstraction. My wife and I joke oftentimes when we're sitting at bed, almost ready to go to sleep. She reads books about how to do things. She likes mechanical things. It's kind of strange. I read books about why we do things, and she just does them. So I'm grateful that we are way too comfortable with abstraction, and it is in this light that I am just deeply, deeply grateful for your presence here, helping us to ground the academic research that we've done in ways that we're just not capable of imagining. It's your real life experience, it's your real life work that I think in interacting with the kind of scholarship that we do that has the potential of being so fruitful. So thank you very much for coming, for being a part of this. The Institute's in the Institute's mission statement, we have 3 objectives. One is to do the highest level, the highest quality research we can do on the most important questions that can be asked of our generation. And our goal there is to create new paradigms of thinking. Our experience is that the dominant paradigms in our political culture and in so many professional circles are just worn out. They're no longer getting the kind of traction that we need. New paradigms, and that means that we have to do research in new ways. A second objective is to train a generation of young scholars to do this kind of work, to expand our work in that way. A third objective of the Institute is to serve the common good. We really believe, to a member, that knowledge should serve the common good. And I wanted to ask a question before, on this point, but I wanted to ask a question. How many of you know each other? Have you ever been together as a group? Is this the first time you've been together as a group? Just anyone. Do you all meet as a group on a regular basis? Is this... Well, maybe quite apart from anything that you've heard from us or learned from us, maybe the best thing about today is just having gotten together. And maybe that can happen again. I think if there is a lesson that we would like to communicate, it is to echo the point that was just made. It's about the power of culture. We tend to think that it's all about technique. It's all about our strategy. If we just have the right strategy, the right tactics, if we can just manipulate the dials in our families or in our society in just the right ways, it's all about what we can consciously apprehend and manipulate. And if we can just do that, we can solve the problems that we have and confront. And it seems to me here, as in other areas of the Institute's research, this particular research shows that the story is more complicated. And again, I think it highlights the independent, relatively autonomous power of culture. As Lisa Belkin put it, how you parent, what you do as a parent, is a function of who you are. But what I want to say, or what we would want to say, is who you are is a function of the moral universe, or it's a function of the normative culture that you inhabit. And that normative culture is not one thing. It's fragmented. It's many things. There are patterns of culture that are bigger than we are, patterns of culture that we didn't create, that exist independent of our will, and which we are barely conscious of. But these patterns of culture not only form us as parents, but they form our children. Knowledge in service of a common good. What this means to us, to echo a point that Jeff made earlier, is that effective intervention in ways that contribute to the flourishing of all requires us to understand these worlds, these cultures from the inside. And hopefully, again, we're able to participate in a conversation that will not only enhance our understanding as scholars, but also enhance your ability as practitioners to intervene even more effectively. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing with us. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the months to come.